I'm very aware that these works that are going to be in this exhibition represent some various different approaches. And of course, one has to keep in mind that they represent work over quite a number of years. And one of the concerns I'm always having about a show like this is that I trust there will be enough examples in each period to indicate that these things didn't just happen overnight. And in fact, I would say in any given period of time, each one of these groupings of paintings might have lasted 7 or 8 or 10 or 15 years. And the changes do not take place overnight. They're very slowly evolving. In many instances, they might be a year or two before I even decide I want to show one of the things or the other. As far as where they come from, that's, of course, the most fascinating question. I would say that for an artist, or I'm sure for anyone, you have some inner sense of what is meaning for you. And you see certain configurations of things, or you have certain experiences, and somehow they touch some core of meaning within you, and you right away connect that to some other meanings that you've had in your mind for a long time. And before you know it, some kind of amalgamation of some different sorts of strains you start to realize might be a direction that you very much are seeking to go into. I would say the most important ingredient of an artist is a tremendous will and desire to want to be an artist. And I derive that from my own experiences and, of course, also from my long years of experience as a teacher. I look back at the hundreds of students I have had over the years, and if you were to ask me at a point when they were 20 years old or 21 in school, who of these people would maybe someday go on and do something, I would never have guessed right. Because at that time, I would never have been able to have the opportunity of knowing who really had that drive. Now, obviously, you need more than drive, but if you had to answer that question in one simple word, I would say tremendous drive. As far as a sense of place that a lot of these works seem to evidence is, of course, very true. It's not so much that the place itself is significant, other than that something happened to me in that place. And it isn't so much that I think that's an important place. And I'd like to add, it isn't so much that a place has to have all kinds of fantastic connotations for you, or that you have to even be very, very familiar with it. And I'm always interested many times of how scholars try to follow influences of artists over the ages and see if a person studied a certain kind of period before him or a certain place before him. And the realization is you might just see one thing at one time, and it's like turning on a switch to a whole configuration of ideas that have already been within you. And usually, I suppose, when you go to a new place, there's the novelty of the exoticism of the place, the excitement of just the newness of it. It's different from your everyday world. And I guess that obviously has a great deal to do with how a different place might excite your imagination. So in that sense, a sense of place is very significant that way. If you look at this show, you will find that my being in New Orleans almost didn't even appear in any kind of sense or way. Many times I would look around the lush, wonderful quality of this place and was very taken by it. And I certainly would even advise many students to go look at it and do something with it. And it just so happened that at that time, I was just doing something so different that I couldn't see the connection between what I was doing and its lush vegetation, which meant that it just hadn't gelled enough or gestated enough at that lower level for me to see that, or to see where my part in it could be. So it's not so much that you're responding to something, it's almost as if that something is responding to you. And then there was a period of time that I very avowedly and consciously sought out the whole regional quality of this place in terms of the swamps and in terms of the sea and in terms of aquatic material. And I very consciously did that. But I'd like to add, it was always there. I just wasn't doing something that could amalgamate with it at the time, but it lurked there all the time. The first time I was in Italy was way back in the late 50s, and I was doing something again at that time that I couldn't at all associate with these wonderful things I was seeing, because they were associated with a lot of art I had seen, some of it good, some of it pretty horrible, and that problem kind of kept me away from it. It wasn't almost till 20 years later that I could see what I could have done with it. I would say the artist that most affected me to want to be an artist was somebody like Titian and El Greco when I was a young boy, and they had the biggest impact on me and still do. And of course in later years I would think someone like Paul Klee, even more than the Picasso and the Matisses, who of course were also tremendous influences, his very kinds of thinking and the way he thought about form, and he even coined an expression called form thinking. And I would say his theoretical notions, his attitude, his tremendous imaginative scope probably had the greatest influence on me. Part of it is a sense that I think of a phrase of Emerson's all the time that says that images are the embers of our very best feelings, and that kind of always struck me and sensed of a very important quality for me, in that there's something immediate about an image, and there's something that sets off a whole configuration of thought in a given image. And the factor of color has always fascinated me, and that's why I've been inclined to go towards painting. And what do I want to communicate with that? I want to communicate a great sense of how I feel about the meaning of things. Whether I do that successfully or not, of course, is an open question. But my intent is always to have a strong enough feeling that I feel has some kind of a universal sense, and hopefully it will be transmitted to others. And as we know, whatever you say or do is only going to be of value if someone else's dreams are paralleling your dreams, and then it will touch someone. You obviously can't take a Gallup poll and see what will best communicate to everybody like a politician does, and you know that you're going to always have a limited audience. But interestingly enough, someone always does respond, and that's enough. And it's interesting to remember in Van Gogh's time, outside of his brother, I can't quite recall anyone that was as responsive to his work, and he just needed that one person. Well, I would definitely say the person in the contemporary scene, contemporary meaning within the last several decades. Rothko, of course, who became a close friend, influenced me a great deal, not so much actually in his actual art, but in the quality of his scope, the quality of his outlook, and that he envisioned the form of painting as I always have, that painting is not just putting colors on a canvas, it's dealing with all of the human condition, it's paralleling all of one's thoughts, and one of the great things that I always see in painting and have felt about painting is that I can relate and say things about lots of things, and other than just the fact of some very pleasant something that someone might hang on a wall. And Rothko, of course, was very much of that mind, and the great spiritual impact he had about painting was something that I very much was taken by and of course very responsive to. And one of the reasons I suppose that we sort of got along very well and had a lot to say to each other. Well, the word spiritual, of course, is thrown a lot very readily and easily. And obviously what it means is that there are forces, there are energies, and there are issues that are beyond what you're immediately seeing. And of course that is ultimately an act of faith that that exists. On the other hand, if that didn't exist, I doubt that we would be responding to the arts as we do. And it's just that, as we all know, and even scientists today acknowledge, that everything we do know and can comprehend or apprehend is not only those things which our senses can apprehend. And I would say all art is predicated on the fact that there's always something there beyond what you see. Like a couple of notes out of Mozart, a couple of simple notes that any kid could play on a piano, but why do they touch us that way? I always liked the phrase that the late architect, great architect Kahn used, and he said, to begin is a belief in form, and that had a great significant meaning for me. And I would say I have to have a great belief in some kind of a form before I start a work. And form, you might say, isn't just some nice arrangement of shapes and colors, as it might be conventionally thought about. It's almost, again, some structure, the substructure by which things reveal themselves. And of course, the subject matter of what they are, or the kinds of shapes of what they might consist of, are almost superficial aspects of what that inner form is. And I might give some examples of what I mean by inner form. For example, if we look at some of the great art of the past, I think, for example, one can characterize Michelangelo's inner form by saying it was almost like a brute force that wanted to be released. And if you look at these captive slaves in stone that had to be released, and of course, in this sense, we might even infer it was a spiritual release. And I think that quality permeates all of Michelangelo's work, no matter what he does, including that big dome he builds over the cathedral. When you look at somebody like Van Gogh's work, he might do a head, he might do a flower, he might do a wheat field, and it's almost a bunch of almost electric molecules that are being slashed on that canvas, almost looking for the subcommon denominator of what made everything happen. So his inner form is almost a dramatic insightfulness as to what constitutes matter. I mean inner form in that very specific kind of sense. And again, whether he did a portrait or whether he did a landscape was a superficial variation of what that inner form was. Now, as you could see in this exhibition, I have not only done some things in different styles and certainly different subject matter, but I'm trusting that the inner form that guides it, which is something that I could speak of, but again, I'd like to think of a wonderful phrase that has affected me by T.S. Eliot, and that is, you don't start with a meaning of something, you go towards it, meaning that the very evolution and the making of the work, the very impetus to make it, is to almost look for the meaning. So if you will, I'm looking for that inner form. And interestingly enough, my very first trip to Mexico was in 1947. Now, Mexico affected me a great deal at that time. Something about the color, something about the people there was extraordinarily effective to me. And of course, remember again, as this exhibit now evidences at the museum, this was something in the air with a lot of American artists that looked south of the border for color, for exoticness and all that. And yet I was driven to go there and was delighted that I would have that opportunity when I did go. And a lot of my early work was very much derived from the dignity I felt in the indigenous people there and the magnificent landscape there. And I also, for the first time, had seen pre-Columbian art, which at that time was all stacked up in some big old anthropological museum. It wasn't that beautiful museum that is there now. And that affected me a great deal. But again, doing what I was doing then, the awarenesses I had then, I had no idea what I could do with this material. But I know it affected me a great deal. And of course, that's something like over 40 years ago. And for some reason or other, I always intended to do something with it. And I guess the inner form that I saw in this pre-Columbian art hit something in me that dealt with it consonant with what I felt. And the very fact that they didn't make distinctions between what was abstract in a thing and what was representational in a thing, issues which have concerned me for great numbers of years. Interestingly enough, I've come to the realization might not really be great issues at all, at least for the moment as I see the situation. And there was something about that very exciting calligraphic line that I saw in their glyphs. I'd always even been interested in Islamic art, which also has that very fascinating calligraphic line element to it. But of course they were prohibited from using figurative images. And I would say this art somehow said, this is what I might have always wanted to do with it, and it was the seed. Not that I remotely want to do anything that's Mayan art. And I just felt, again, it met me as much as I met it. Yeah. That thread of looking into exotic past and images is a very dangerous one, and I'm always very concerned about it, because again, the exoticness can be of a very superficial nature, it can be of a very transient, seductive nature, and again, it's a matter of what might be more inherently integral in it that is consonant with what you want to do. But it's a very difficult borderline to disassociate exoticness, quote, in a superficial sense, and exoticness that might just be a way of going to a world a little different and more emphatic than your own, or that you don't see in your own world. And I would say exoticness in that sense, and going back to the sense of place, definitely has a big factor involved in it. Having a retrospective exhibit like this is an extremely important event for many reasons. One is that you will have an opportunity yourself to see a varying body of works that you haven't some things I haven't seen for 30 or 40 years, and even don't recollect them. Sometimes I like them more, sometimes I like them less. Sometimes I'm surprised I like them at all, especially if they're 40 years old. And I do sometimes, not always. And then every artist wants to, of course, reach out. Now, and I would doubt that any artist just works for himself. I think that's a myth. You want to reach out, but again, you can't do it as a politician with a Gallup poll. And I hope this affords an opportunity for people that are not too familiar with my work, as well as those who are, to have a sense of seeing its growth, of seeing its inception, and the varying journeys that I myself went through, and share with me those journeys.